In the autumn of 1886, ranchers across the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory watched a sheep man do something none of them could explain. Caleb Hollister was stuffing his cabin walls with raw wool, not lining a basket, not stacking fleeces in the barn for spring trade, packing it, pound after pound, layer after layer, pressed firmly between the inner planking and the outer logs of his modest two-room homestead. The work began on the first cold morning of October and did not stop until the snow line crept down from the Sapphire Mountains. At first, the few neighbors who rode past assumed he was preparing fleeces for sale and using the cabin as a temporary storage place. That assumption did not survive the second week. Wool kept arriving at the homestead. Wool kept disappearing into the walls. His 8-year-old son, Eli, followed behind him through every working day, dragging burlap sacks half his own size and feeding handfuls of carded fleece into narrow gaps between studs. An aging border collie named Finn lay in the doorway, watching the work with the patient curiosity that older dogs sometimes carry. By the end of the second week, the rough planks Caleb had nailed up inside the cabin formed a complete inner shell. Behind that shell, somewhere between 2 and 4 inches of clean, dry, lanolin-rich wool now stood between the family and the outside air. From within the cabin, the change was invisible. From outside, nothing looked different at all. That was what bothered people most. There were no fancy improvements to admire, no clever carpentry to study. Only the slow, expensive, baffling decision to stuff raw fleeces into walls that already stood. In a country where every pound of wool fetched cash at the railhead in Missoula, this was not eccentricity. This was something close to waste. Cattle rancher Jasper Crow rode by one afternoon to deliver a message from the postmaster and finally stopped his horse beside the cabin. "What in the world are you doing, Caleb?" The reply came after Caleb pressed another handful of fleece into a gap near the window frame. "Keeping the cold out." That was the entire answer. No reasoning, no figures, no explanation of why a man would bury good marketable wool inside the walls of a house. Jasper studied the cabin for a long moment, then studied Caleb, and could find no further question worth asking. He rode home shaking his head. By the middle of October, the story had reached the saloon in Hamilton, the trading post at Stevensville, and the loading yard at the railroad spur where ranchers gathered while waiting on shipments. Within a fortnight, every man within 30 miles seemed to know that the widower up at the Hollister place had lost his sense over wool. They had a name for him before the first hard frost arrived. They called him Wool Walls Hollister. The name was not affectionate. Mordecai Voss, who owned the largest cattle operation in the valley and bought lumber by the wagon load, declared the whole project foolish during a card game one evening. A man could insulate that cabin proper with sawdust and tar paper for half the price and twice the result. Wool belongs on a sheep's back or a buyer's scale. Anywhere else and you're throwing away money. The men around the table laughed and agreed. Old Pete Larkin, a carpenter who had built cabins from Helena down to Salt Lake, was even harsher. "Wool draws moths. Wool holds damp. Wool catches fire faster than tinder when a stove pipe gets hot. He's building himself a coffin made of fleece, and that boy is going to pay the price come spring." Caleb heard the talk. Everyone did. The valley was small that way. The trading post was where news traveled, and news always traveled twice in country where the winters were long and the entertainment was thin. Yet Caleb did not defend himself. He did not argue. He did not explain. He simply rode home each evening, unloaded another bale of wool from the back of his wagon, and got back to work. Eli helped without question. Finn watched without judgment. And somewhere beneath all the laughter, a quieter feeling began to settle over a few of the older settlers, the ones who had seen too many Montana winters to dismiss anything entirely. The wool kept disappearing into the walls, and winter was still 6 weeks away. The talk about Wool Walls Hollister did not fade as October deepened. If anything, it sharpened. Men who had laughed mildly at first began laughing louder once they realized that Caleb intended to finish what he had started. Some accounts grew taller in the telling. By the time the story reached the cattle camps along the Clark Fork, Listeners were hearing that Caleb had crammed 600 pounds of wool into the cabin walls. By the time it reached the lumber camps farther north, the number had doubled. None of it was accurate. None of it needed to be. What mattered was that the story had become useful, the kind of tale men shared when they wanted to feel certain about their own choices. Caleb noticed the change in how people greeted him at the trading post. Some still nodded politely. Others avoided his eye. A few made a point of speaking to him with the careful patience reserved for men whose judgment had become questionable. He took it all without complaint. There was work to do, and complaining had never warmed a single room in his life. Inside the cabin, the rooms had already begun feeling different. Even on cold afternoons when the wind cut down out of the canyons, the inside of the Hollister home held its warmth longer than it ever had before. Eli noticed it first. He came in one evening with snowflakes still clinging to his collar and announced that the kitchen felt like a summer porch. Caleb said nothing in reply, but he allowed himself a small private nod beside the stove. The idea had not come from nowhere. Caleb had grown up in the high country of Wales before his family emigrated, and his grandfather had been a shepherd in a valley where winters could bury a stone cottage to its eaves. The old man had spoken often of how the Highland farmers packed fleece between the layers of their walls and roofs. Lanolin in the wool repelled moisture. Air trapped between the fibers held heat. A fleece thick enough could keep a lamb alive through a night that froze water in iron buckets. The wisdom had been quiet, practical, and ancient, the kind that travels through families without ever finding its way into books. When Caleb was a boy, he had not paid much attention. The lessons had simply sat in the back of his mind like seeds waiting on the right soil. Years later, after his wife Marin died of fever during the dry summer of 1884, those memories began returning to him in long evenings beside the stove. Eli was small then, only 6, and prone to coughs when the wind turned cold. Caleb had watched his son struggle through 2 Montana winters in a drafty cabin that bled heat through every chink in the logs. By the time the 3rd winter approached, the father had made up his mind. He would not bury another member of his family in this valley if he could help it. What had begun as a memory became a plan. What had begun as a plan became a project. By early autumn of 1886, Caleb had sheared his own small flock twice that year, traded labor with 2 neighbors to buy their excess fleeces, and saved every dollar he could spare for additional wool from the brokers at Stevensville. The cabin walls now held more than 400 pounds of clean fleece, packed with care and protected behind tight inner planking that he had nailed up himself during the long evenings. The arithmetic of the project had made sense to him from the beginning. The arithmetic had made sense to no one else. One cold afternoon, old Pete Larkin rode out to the homestead with the stated purpose of buying a young ram. The real purpose became clear within minutes. Pete walked the perimeter of the cabin, knocked his knuckles against the planking, peered up at the roofline, and finally turned to Caleb with the expression of a man delivering hard news to a friend. "You've made a fire trap, Caleb. You know that, don't you? One ember from the stovepipe, one spark catching on the inside of that wool, and there won't be enough of this cabin left to bury." Caleb looked at the older carpenter for a long moment before answering. "The wool's packed tight. Tight wool doesn't burn easy, it smolders, and I've rooted the pipe through stone." Pete shook his head slowly. "Stone cracks, stoves leak. You're betting that boy's life on a notion." Caleb did not answer Pete Larkin that afternoon. He simply walked the old carpenter to his horse, thanked him for the visit, and watched him ride down the trail toward the valley road. But the words stayed with him after Pete was gone. They sat in his chest through supper. They followed him out to the barn while he checked on the ewes. Late that night, after Eli had fallen asleep beneath 3 wool blankets in the corner loft, Caleb stood beside the stove with a lantern in his hand and examined every inch of the pipe where it climbed toward the roof. He had built that pipe with care. Stone collar at the ceiling penetration, a full 18 inches of clearance from any framing timber, 2 layers of sheet tin nailed around the stone for added protection. The wool nearest the pipe had been packed less densely than the rest, leaving a deliberate buffer of still air between the heat source and the fleece. None of it had been accidental, yet Pete's warning had been honest, and honest warnings from experienced men deserved a second look. Caleb spent nearly 2 hours that night going over the work, tightening one bracket, repositioning a section of stovepipe shielding by a fraction of an inch, and finally satisfying himself that the cabin would not betray his son in the dark. The next morning he was back at the wagon by sunrise, hauling the last load of fleeces home from a neighbor's barn 10 miles south. The wool came from a small operation run by a widow named Hattie Reese, whose husband had died the previous spring, leaving behind a flock she could no longer manage alone. She had sold most of her sheep already and had been glad to find a buyer for the remaining wool at a fair price. As Caleb loaded the bundles into the wagon, Hattie watched him from the porch with an expression that was neither approval nor doubt but something closer to recognition. "My grandmother did the same thing in Vermont," she said quietly. "Lined her whole farmhouse with sheep's wool before the winter of 1816. They called it the year without a summer. The crops froze. The cattle starved. Half the families in our township lost children to the cold. Grandmother lost none." Caleb looked up from the wagon bed. How thick did she pack it? Hattie thought for a moment. 6 inches, maybe more. She said the cold would always find a way in unless you gave it something soft to settle into. Caleb nodded slowly and finished loading the wool without further conversation. As he rode home with the last of his supply, he felt for the first time in many weeks that someone else in this country understood what he was building. By the final week of October, the work was complete. The cabin walls held wool from foundation sill to roof plate. The interior planking had been sanded, sealed, and whitewashed until the rooms looked almost cheerful. The stovepipe ran clean through stone and tin. The ceiling above the loft had received a separate layer of fleece, packed between the joists and covered with planking from below. Even the door had been reworked, with a thin felt strip running along the inside edge to seal it tighter against the frame. From outside, the cabin looked unchanged. From inside, it had become something new. That same week, the first real cold of the season descended on the Bitterroot Valley. The thermometer at the trading post dropped to 11 degrees overnight, and frost killed the last of the kitchen gardens up and down the basin. Men spent the morning hauling extra firewood, checking livestock, and complaining about how early winter had arrived. At the Hollister cabin, Caleb stoked the stove only once during the evening and once again before bed. The kitchen held at 68 degrees through the night without further attention. Eli slept without a blanket pulled over his head for the first autumn in years. The next morning, when Caleb walked out to feed the sheep, the air outside hit him like a slap of cold water. He stood for a moment on the porch, watching his breath rise in the gray light, and listened to the silence of a valley locked in early frost. Behind him, smoke drifted thin and steady from the chimney. Inside, his son still slept warm. The first quiet test had been passed. The harder ones were still ahead. The first snow of the season fell on the 3rd of November, light and dry and gone by mid-morning. The second snow came 4 days later and stayed. By the second week of the month, the lower meadows of the Bitterroot Valley wore a steady white blanket, and the trails leading up to the higher pastures had grown treacherous with hidden ice. Caleb spent those weeks finishing the smaller tasks that always seemed to pile up before winter settled in for good. He repaired a section of the sheep shelter where the wind had pried loose a board. He split and stacked another 2 cords of firewood against the south wall of the cabin. He oiled the hinges of the doors and the windows. He checked the root cellar for the 3rd time that month and counted the jars of preserves, the sacks of dried beans, the smoked venison hanging from the rafters. Eli helped with all of it. The boy had grown taller that year, and his hands had begun to develop the callous strength that came from working alongside a father who knew no other way. There was something in Caleb's quiet patience that made Eli listen carefully, and there was something in Eli's eager seriousness that made Caleb soften without ever quite admitting it. They were not a talkative pair. They did not need to be. The work spoke for them, and the long evenings beside the stove filled the rest. Talk in the valley had begun to shift slightly by mid-November. The laughter had not stopped, but it had grown quieter. A few of the older settlers, the ones who had watched their share of winters chew through poorly built cabins, started mentioning Caleb's project in tones that were not quite mocking anymore. Jasper Crow rode out one afternoon under the pretense of borrowing a handsaw, but the real purpose became clear when he lingered in the doorway and asked, almost casually, how the inside of the cabin had been holding the cold. Caleb invited him in for coffee. Jasper stayed nearly an hour. When he left, he did not say much. But he rode home thoughtful, and that night, lying in his own drafty cabin where the wind whistled through 3 different cracks above his bed, he found himself wondering whether the sheep man had stumbled onto something the rest of them had missed. The same could not be said for Mordecai Voss. The big cattle rancher had grown more vocal as the weeks passed, not less. He had a way of holding court at the trading post, leaning against the counter with one elbow propped and his coffee cup half raised, and a way of turning any topic toward his own opinions before the listener had a chance to redirect. "I'll tell you what's going to happen up at the Hollister place," he announced one afternoon while 3 other men nodded along. "First good cold snap, the moisture's going to settle into all that wool. By February it'll be soaked through. By March it'll be black with mold. By April that man will be tearing out every inch of it and rebuilding his cabin from the studs out, only this time he'll be doing it with frozen fingers and an empty purse." The other men chuckled. Mordecai went on. "Wool's a living material. It wants to breathe. You seal it up behind planking and you've sentenced it to rot. My father saw it happen back in Ohio. Fellow tried something similar with horsehair and burlap. Whole structure had to come down before the second winter. The story was almost certainly invented. Mordecai's father had died when Mordecai was 4 years old, and there was no record of any Ohio cabin ever being insulated with horsehair and burlap. But the men around him did not know that, and Mordecai had long since learned that confidence sold better than accuracy. The story circulated. The doubts deepened. What none of those men knew was that Caleb had already considered the moisture problem at length. The lanolin in raw wool was naturally water-resistant, repelling humidity rather than absorbing it. The inner planking had been sealed against vapor. The roof had been pitched and tarred to shed snowmelt cleanly. Even the foundation had received attention, with a course of flat stones laid beneath the sill logs to keep ground moisture from rising into the wall cavity. The system was not perfect. No system was. But it had been built by a man who had thought carefully about every objection long before his neighbors raised them. The cold deepened through the 3rd week of November. Each morning brought a thinner light and a sharper bite, and by the 20th of the month the thermometer at the trading post had dropped below 0 twice in 3 nights. Ranchers throughout the valley began the familiar rituals of deep winter. Cattle were moved to the lower pastures where the wind broke less savagely. Wood piles were doubled. Water troughs were checked twice a day for ice. Children were kept closer to home, and visits between neighbors grew shorter and more purposeful. The valley settled into the slow rhythm that Montana settlers knew well, the rhythm of endurance. At the Hollister cabin, the rhythm felt different. Caleb noticed it himself when he came in from chores one evening and realized that he had stopped thinking about the cold the way he used to. In previous winters, his first act upon entering the cabin had always been to throw another log onto the fire, regardless of how recently the stove had been fed. The habit had been so automatic that he had not noticed himself doing it. This year he found himself crossing the room without that reflex, hanging his coat on its peg, and only checking the stove when he sat down to read. The kitchen held its warmth the way a wool blanket held a sleeper, steady, patient, without drama. Eli noticed too. The boy had taken to spending his evenings at the small table near the window, working through arithmetic problems from a primer Caleb had ordered from a mercantile in Helena. In the past, Eli's hands had often grown stiff with cold by the time he finished his lessons, and his handwriting in the late pages of his notebook had always grown cramped and shaky. This year, the handwriting stayed steady to the end. The boy wrote with bare fingers and never once tucked them under his arms for warmth. One evening near the end of November, a visitor arrived at the Hollister homestead whom Caleb had not expected. The man was Dr. Ezra Hatch, the only physician serving the valley between Hamilton and Stevensville. He was a thin, soft-spoken man in his 50s, with a graying beard and a habit of pausing for long moments before he spoke. He rode a sturdy gray mare and carried his medical bag strapped behind the saddle. Caleb had not seen him since the spring of 1884, when Dr. Hatch had ridden out 3 nights in a row trying to save Marin from the fever that eventually took her. The memory was not an easy one for either man, and they greeted each other carefully. "I was passing on my way back from the Anders place," Dr. Hatch said, brushing snow from his shoulders as Caleb led him inside. "I wanted to look in on the boy. The Anders youngest is fighting a chest cold, and I find myself thinking about all the children in this valley when one of them takes ill." He set his bag on the kitchen table and accepted the cup of coffee Caleb offered. Eli stood near the stove watching him, polite but uncertain in the way children often were around men who had once attended their dying mothers. The doctor sat at the table and looked carefully around the cabin. His eyes moved across the planked walls, the sealed window frames, the felt-lined door, and finally returned to Caleb. "It's warm in here," he said. "Warmer than any home I've visited today, and I've been in 7 of them." Caleb nodded. "The walls hold heat better than they used to." Dr. Hatch took a slow sip of his coffee. "I've heard the talk, Caleb. The whole valley has heard the talk. I came here partly because I wanted to see for myself whether the boy was being kept properly through the cold." The words could have been an insult. They were not. There was something in the doctor's voice that suggested he had come not to judge but to understand. Caleb invited him to examine Eli, and the doctor did so with the unhurried thoroughness that had earned him respect throughout the valley. He listened to the boy's chest. He looked at his hands and feet. He asked questions about sleep and appetite. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "This child is healthier than he was last winter, by a considerable margin." Caleb did not reply right away. He had built the cabin's wool walls for many reasons, but the deepest of them had always been the boy. To hear those words spoken aloud by a doctor who had seen Eli through his worst seasons was to receive a kind of confirmation that Caleb had not realized he was waiting for. He set his coffee cup down carefully and looked across the table at Dr. Hatch. "He used to cough through every cold spell, sometimes for weeks." The doctor nodded slowly. "I remember. I treated him for it twice. Last winter I worried he was developing a chronic condition." He glanced toward Eli, who had returned to his arithmetic at the small table by the window. "Whatever you've done here, Caleb, it's working. The air in this cabin is dry but not parched. It's warm but not stifling. The boy is breathing easily. That matters more than people in this valley realize." The visit lasted another half hour. Dr. Hatch asked questions about the construction, the wool, the way Caleb had handled the moisture and the ventilation. He listened with the quiet attention of a man who had spent his life observing things others overlooked. He did not promise to defend Caleb at the trading post. He did not need to. When he finally rode away into the gathering dusk, Caleb stood on the porch for a long time watching the gray mare disappear down the trail. The cold settled around him without finding any purchase. He went back inside to a kitchen that still held its warmth from the morning's fire. The first week of December passed in steady, manageable cold. The thermometer hovered between 5 and 15 below zero on most mornings, and the snow had built up enough that the trails required careful breaking each day. Caleb spent his time tending to the sheep, hauling water, and checking the small details of the cabin that he had learned to watch through winters past. He examined the planking for any sign of moisture seeping in from the wool cavity. He inspected the foundation stones. He climbed up onto the roof during a still afternoon and checked the chimney mortar for cracks. Everything held. The cabin had begun to feel, in some quiet way, almost alive, as if it were a partner in the work of getting through winter rather than a structure to be fought against. Then came the night of December 8th, when the air over the Bitterroot Valley grew strangely still. Caleb noticed it as he came in from the evening chores. There had been no wind for nearly an hour, and the silence over the snowfields felt different from ordinary silence. It carried a weight to it, the kind of quiet that old settlers learned to mistrust. The sky was clear and dark, scattered with hard winter stars, and the temperature was falling faster than it had any right to. By the time Caleb finished his supper, the thermometer outside the kitchen window read 22 below zero. By the time he banked the stove for the night, it read 28 below. He went outside one last time before bed, just to check on the sheep. The cold seized him the moment he stepped off the porch. It was the kind of cold that pressed against the skin like a physical thing, that pulled the breath from a man's lungs and turned it instantly to crystal in the air around his face. He moved quickly. The sheep were huddled in the deep straw of the shelter, packed tightly together for warmth, and Caleb checked the door latch and the wind brakes before hurrying back to the cabin. Inside, the warmth wrapped around him like a familiar coat. He closed the door, slid the bolt, and stood for a moment with his back against the wood, letting his fingers come back to life. Eli was already asleep in the loft, buried under two wool blankets that he had not bothered to pull all the way up. Finn lay beside the stove with his nose tucked under one paw. Caleb sat down at the kitchen table and lit the small oil lamp. He looked at the thermometer mounted on the inside wall near the window. 66 degrees, the same number it had read 3 hours earlier. Outside, the cold continued to deepen. Somewhere in the dark beyond the valley, something larger was gathering. Caleb did not know it yet, but the coldest night in 50 years was about to begin. The morning of December 9th dawned with a stillness that the older settlers of the Bitterroot Valley would talk about for the rest of their lives. The thermometer at the trading post in Stevensville read 41 degrees below zero at sunrise. The thermometer at the railroad spur read 43. The one nailed to the wall outside the Hamilton Mercantile had cracked sometime during the night, its mercury fractured into useless silver beads inside the broken glass. Old men who had lived in the valley since the early years of settlement said they could not remember a cold like this one. A few of them, the very oldest, said it reminded them of the bitter winter of 1836, when the streams froze solid to their beds and the cattle died standing up in the fields. Caleb woke before sunrise to a sound he had never heard before. It was a deep, slow popping noise, irregular and distant, and it took him several moments to understand what it was. The logs of the cabin walls were contracting in the cold. Wood that had stood through a dozen winters was being squeezed by a temperature it had never quite encountered before, and the timbers were complaining audibly. Caleb sat up in his bed and listened. The sounds came from the north wall, the one that faced the wind, and they came at irregular intervals like the cracking of a frozen lake. He pulled on his boots and his heavy coat and walked carefully through the kitchen toward the door. The thermometer inside the cabin read 63 degrees. Caleb stared at it for a long moment. He had banked the stove low overnight, expecting to lose perhaps 8 or 10 degrees by morning, and instead the cabin had given up only 3. He turned and went to the door. When he opened it, the cold poured into the room like water pouring into a sinking boat. He stepped quickly outside, pulled the door shut behind him, and felt his lungs seize at the first breath. The air was painful to inhale. It scraped at the inside of his throat like sand. The thermometer mounted beside the door read 44 below zero. Caleb stared at it, then stared again, certain that his eyes were playing tricks on him. The number did not change. He looked out across the valley. Smoke rose from chimneys in the distance, thin and straight as needles, unable to spread sideways through air that had grown too still and too dense to carry it. The snow underfoot squeaked sharply with every step, the high brittle sound that came only in the deepest cold. Caleb made his way quickly to the sheep shelter, broke a thin sheet of ice from the water trough, checked that the animals were alive and breathing, and hurried back to the cabin before his fingers lost their feeling entirely. Inside, the warmth was almost staggering. He stood for a moment letting it work into him, then closed the door carefully and added wood to the stove. Eli was awake by then, sitting up in the loft with his hair tousled and his face puzzled. "Why is it so quiet outside, Papa?" Caleb thought about how to answer. The truth was that the valley had gone silent because the cold had killed the wind, and the cold had killed the wind because something rare was happening across the entire northern country. He chose simpler words. "It's the coldest morning I've ever seen, Eli. We're staying inside today." The boy nodded as if this were ordinary news and climbed down from the loft to dress beside the stove. By mid-morning, the news of the temperature was traveling through the valley by whatever means the cold allowed. A few hardy souls had ridden the short distances between neighbors, faces wrapped to the eyes and hands buried inside double mittens, carrying reports of frozen well pumps and split water barrels. Dr. Hatch sent his stable boy on horseback to check on the elderly Wilkins couple 2 miles south of Hamilton, and the boy came back with frostbite on his cheeks and the news that the Wilkins stove had cracked during the night. Jasper Crow lost 2 calves before noon. Mordecai Voss spent the morning fighting to keep his bunkhouse warm enough that his hired hands would not abandon him for warmer country. In every cabin throughout the valley, the same struggle was unfolding. Every cabin except one. The cold did not break that day. It deepened. By mid-afternoon, the thermometer outside the Hollister cabin read 46 below zero, and by sunset it had fallen to 49. The light went out of the valley early, drained away into the white of the snowfields, and the stars came back into a sky so clear and hard that they looked sharp enough to cut. Caleb fed the stove 3 times during the day, no more than that. The cabin held its warmth with a steadiness that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The thermometer on the kitchen wall did not drop below 64 degrees at any point. Eli spent the afternoon at the table with his arithmetic book, then moved to the floor beside Finn and read aloud to the old dog from a worn copy of stories that had belonged to his mother. Caleb listened from his chair beside the window. He watched the boy's voice find the rhythm of the sentences, watched his small hands turn the pages without trembling, watched his bare feet curl comfortably against the dog's warm side. Outside, the valley was dying by degrees. Inside, a child was reading a story to a sleeping dog. The contrast settled into Caleb's chest with a weight he did not know how to name. Somewhere between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, a knock came at the door. Caleb crossed the kitchen and slid the bolt back. Standing on the porch in a coat so frosted that the wool had turned white was Jasper Crow. His face was wrapped to the eyes in a heavy scarf, and a thin film of ice had formed in the fibers around his mouth where his breath had condensed and frozen. He did not speak. He could not. Caleb pulled him inside without a word, closed the door against the cold, and helped him out of the frozen coat. It took several minutes for Jasper to recover enough to speak. He sat in the chair nearest the stove, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water, his face slowly returning to a normal color as the cabin's warmth worked into him. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "My stove cracked, sometime around noon. I tried to patch it with stove black and tin, but the cold's in the walls now and I can't get the room above 40 degrees. The wife and the baby are at the Larkin place. Pete took them in when I rode out to look for help. I didn't know where else to come." Caleb listened without interrupting. When Jasper finished, he stood and went to the small cabinet near the stove and brought out a bottle of whiskey that he kept for emergencies. He poured a small measure into Jasper's water. "You'll stay here tonight. Eli, fetch a blanket from the loft." The boy moved at once. Jasper looked at Caleb with an expression that combined exhaustion and something else, something quieter and more difficult to read. "I didn't come here to take charity from a man I laughed at." Caleb sat down across from him. "You came here because your family needed help. There's no shame in that. There's never been any shame in that." Jasper was quiet for a long time. He drank slowly from the cup. He looked around the cabin, at the planked walls and the steady warmth and the boy now spreading a folded wool blanket across the back of a chair. Finally he said, "How is it possible? How is it this warm in here when it's 50 below outside?" Caleb thought about how to answer. The truth involved lanolin and air pockets and the wisdom of Highland shepherds, but those were not the words Jasper needed in that moment. So Caleb said only, "The wool holds the heat. It does what we built it to do." Jasper nodded slowly, accepting the answer without fully understanding it. That night, Jasper slept on a pallet beside the stove with 2 wool blankets over him. Eli slept in the loft. Finn moved between them at intervals, checking on each in turn the way old dogs do. Caleb sat up later than usual, watching the fire and listening to the wood of the cabin walls pop occasionally in the cold. The thermometer inside the cabin held at 62 degrees through the night. Outside, it fell to 51 below zero before the slow dawn arrived. The cold held for 3 more days. On the morning of December 10th, the thermometer at the Hollister cabin read 48 below zero. On the 11th, it was 45. On the 12th, the temperature began at last to climb, struggling up through the 30 belows and finally cresting above 20 below by late afternoon. By then, the Bitterroot Valley had taken its losses and begun the slow work of counting them. Reports filtered in from every corner of the basin. The Wilkins couple had been found alive in their cabin only because Dr. Hatch had ridden out himself on the second morning and broken down their door. The old man had lost 3 fingers to frostbite. His wife had pulled through with her hands intact, but with a cough that would stay with her until the following spring. 2 hired hands at the Voss Ranch had abandoned their post on the second night and tried to ride south toward warmer country. One had made it. The other was found a week later, frozen upright in his saddle 3 miles from the nearest shelter. Cattle losses across the valley ran into the hundreds. Sheep losses were lighter, partly because the animals were better suited to extreme cold and partly because most sheep operations in the valley were small enough that the shelters could be packed tight against the weather. Old Pete Larkin lost most of his chickens. The Anders family lost a milk cow and very nearly lost the youngest child, who developed pneumonia on the second night and held on by margins so thin that Dr. Hatch refused to leave their cabin for nearly 40 hours. At the Hollister homestead, the losses were none. The sheep had all survived. The cabin had held its warmth without difficulty. Caleb had used roughly half the firewood he would have burned in a normal cold spell, and his root cellar had not lost a single jar of preserves to freezing. Jasper Crow had stayed 3 nights before riding home to rejoin his family at the Larkin place. When he left, he shook Caleb's hand with a grip that lasted longer than necessary. He did not say thank you in words. He did not need to. News of the Hollister cabin spread through the valley faster than the cold had arrived. Dr. Hatch mentioned it to 2 other families during his rounds. Jasper Crow mentioned it at the trading post when he finally returned to retrieve his wife and child. Pete Larkin, of all people, mentioned it himself one afternoon at the saloon in Hamilton. The old carpenter had been thinking about Caleb's project ever since the cold broke, and he had reached the conclusion that he had been wrong. He said so plainly, in front of 6 other men, with the kind of directness that earned him respect rather than ridicule. I told him he was building a coffin. He built the warmest house in the valley. There's no shame in admitting a man saw something I didn't. Mordecai Voss did not admit anything. He grew quieter at the trading post for several weeks, and when the subject of the Hollister cabin came up, he found reasons to change it. By the time spring arrived, he had reshaped his memories of the autumn well enough that he could tell himself he had never doubted the project to begin with. The other men knew better. None of them said anything. There was no profit in humiliating a neighbor who was going to live among them for the rest of their lives. Caleb returned to his ordinary work after the cold broke. He fed his sheep, mended his fences, and spent the long winter evenings reading beside the stove with Eli on the floor at his feet. He did not boast. He did not lecture. When neighbors began asking him questions about the construction of the wool walls, he answered them simply and without embellishment. He drew diagrams on scraps of paper for those who wanted them. He explained the importance of lanolin and air pockets and proper vapor sealing. He recommended Hattie Reese as a source of clean fleece for anyone who wanted to try the method themselves. He charged nothing for any of this. He had never built the walls for profit or for pride. He had built them because his son had needed to live. By the following autumn, 3 other cabins in the Bitterroot Valley had wool packed between their walls. By the autumn after that, the number had grown to 11. Jasper Crow was the first to follow Caleb's example, working through the summer of 1887 with fleeces purchased from Hattie Reese and advice offered freely by the man he had once mocked. Old Pete Larkin worked alongside him for part of the project, taking notes in a small leather book that he kept in his coat pocket. The carpenter had decided that if wool was going to become a building material in this country, he intended to understand it better than anyone else. He spent the winter of 1887 experimenting with different packing densities, different planking arrangements, and different methods of sealing the vapor barriers. By the spring of 1888, he was the most knowledgeable wool wall builder in the territory, and ranchers from as far away as the Big Hole Basin were sending letters asking for his counsel. Caleb watched the spread of the idea with a quiet satisfaction that he never spoke aloud. He had not built his cabin to start a movement. He had built it to keep his son alive through a Montana winter. That the work had grown beyond him, that other families were now benefiting from the wisdom of a Welsh grandfather who had died decades earlier in a country thousands of miles away, felt to Caleb like a kind of grace that did not require comment. He continued tending his sheep. He continued teaching Eli the work of the homestead. He continued spending his evenings beside the stove with the boy and the old dog and the steady warmth of walls packed full of fleece. The name Wool Walls Hollister stayed with him for the rest of his life, but the meaning of the name changed. What had begun as mockery softened first into curiosity, then into respect, and finally into something close to affection. Children growing up in the valley during the 1890s did not remember the laughter of the autumn of 1886. They knew only that the wool walls had become a familiar part of the country, as ordinary in their way as smokehouses and root cellars. They knew that the man who started it all was a quiet sheep rancher who lived with his son in a small cabin at the edge of the basin, and that he had been right about something the rest of the valley had been wrong about. Eli grew tall and strong through those winters. The cough that had once worried Dr. Hatch never returned. He learned the trade of his father, and when he reached the age of 20, he took over the running of the small flock that had grown into a larger one. He married a young woman from Stevensville in 1899 and built his own cabin on a piece of land a half-mile from the original homestead. He packed the walls with wool. He did it without thinking about it, the way a son carries forward the practical wisdom of a father without ever stopping to acknowledge the inheritance. Caleb lived to see his grandchildren born into a cabin warmer than any other in the valley. He lived to see Finn replaced by a younger dog, and that dog replaced by another. He lived to see the railroad expand and the trading post become a proper general store, and the rough trails grow into roads wide enough for 2 wagons to pass. He lived to see the territory become a state. He died in the winter of 1912 at the age of 73, in the same cabin he had built and rebuilt across nearly 30 years, with walls that still held their warmth as steadily as they had on the night of the Great Cold. The lesson he left behind was simple enough that it could be stated in a single sentence, though the sentence itself was rarely spoken in the valley. The strongest protection is not always the kind that looks the strongest. Sometimes wisdom arrives disguised as foolishness. Sometimes it looks like a man stuffing wool into his walls while his neighbors laugh. And sometimes the only verdict that ever truly matters is the one delivered by the season itself, in its own time, on its own terms, with no concern for the opinions of men. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more frontier tales like this one. Leave a comment below telling us what you would have done in Caleb's place. Your support keeps these stories alive for the next generation of listeners. Peace.